Arrogant judge laughs at black man, then karma strikes in a way she never saw coming. The courtroom was Judge Eleanor Lancaster's domain, a place where justice bowed to her will. For 24 years, she had ruled with cold precision, sentencing countless men, many innocent, with a mere flick of her wrist. She didn't need to shout. Her presence alone ensured obedience. Today, Jerome Willis was her next victim. Seated at the defense table, Jerome kept his hands clenched, his gaze fixed downward. A black man accused of armed robbery, no solid evidence, no reliable witnesses, yet he knew how this would end. The system wasn't built for men like him. Fear was pointless. Beside him, Malcolm Carter stood firm, a warrior in a rigged battle. He had fought against corruption for years, but Lancaster was a different beast, ruling not with justice, but control. Malcolm adjusted his tie, his jaw tightening as he looked across the room. The prosecution sat smugly at their table, led by Daniel Calloway, a man who had built his career on pleasing the right people. Calloway wasn't concerned with truth or fairness. He knew the game. He knew Lancaster had already made her decision. His job was merely to perform, to sell the jury a story they had already been primed to believe. "Your Honor," Malcolm began, his voice steady, strong, "the defense moves to dismiss this case on the grounds of insufficient evidence. There is no clear identification, no direct link between my client and the crime. This trial is a farce." Lancaster didn't even blink. She let a moment of silence hang in the air, a cruel game she enjoyed playing before delivering her verdict. Then, with the slightest smirk, she said, "Motion denied." Jerome closed his eyes for half a second. He had expected it, but the finality in her tone still felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Malcolm exhaled sharply. He had prepared for this, but it didn't make it any easier. "Then I moved to suppress." Lancaster raised a hand. "Mr. Carter," she interrupted, her voice as smooth as glass, but as sharp as a blade, "I would advise you to choose your objections wisely. I will not tolerate theatrics in my courtroom." A ripple of tension spread through the room. The jury shifted uneasily. Some of them could see what was happening, but they wouldn't dare acknowledge it. Not here. Not under her rule. Malcolm's fists clenched. This wasn't justice. It never had been. But if Lancaster thought he was going to roll over and let her orchestrate another wrongful conviction, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Daniel Calloway stood with the confidence of a man who had never lost a trial, not because of his skill, but because he had mastered the art of playing the game. He didn't need to prove guilt. He simply needed to reinforce the illusion of it. That was all Judge Eleanor Lancaster required. As long as he delivered a clean performance, one that adhered to the narrative she had already decided, the verdict was assured. His posture was relaxed, his suit crisp, his expression polished into one of casual authority. He wasn't here to fight for justice. He was here to win. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Calloway began, pacing smoothly in front of them, his tone the perfect balance of sincerity and control. "This is not a complicated case. The evidence is clear. The crime was committed, the suspect was identified, and now we are here to ensure that justice is served." He turned slightly, casting a glance at Malcolm Carter before settling his gaze back on the jurors. "The defense would have you believe otherwise. They want to cloud your judgment, distract you with technicalities, make you question what is obvious." Malcolm clenched his jaw but remained silent. He knew Lancaster wouldn't tolerate an interruption, not yet. Calloway was in his element, performing as if this were a well-rehearsed play, delivering lines designed to plant doubt and fear in the minds of the jury. Calloway gestured to the screen behind him. "This is the surveillance footage from the night of April 17th. The video began playing a grainy black and white recording from a convenience store's security camera. A figure, indistinct and blurred, moved across the screen. You can see the suspect entering the store. Notice the build, the posture. This matches the description given by our witness." He paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words settle. Malcolm leaned forward. "Objection, Your Honor. That is a vague assertion, not a fact. The footage is unclear, and there is no direct identification of my client." Lancaster barely looked up from her notes. "Overruled," she said with cool indifference. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He had expected that. He looked at the jury, searching for any flicker of uncertainty. any sign that someone in that box wasn't entirely convinced. He found a few shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but none dared meet his gaze. Calloway resumed as if nothing had happened. Now let's talk about our key witness. Mr. Jenkins, who was present at the scene, has testified that he saw a man fitting the defendant's description fleeing the store. He turned to the jury, his voice steady and reassuring. Of course, Mr. Jenkins is an honest, hard-working citizen. He had no reason to lie. He let the statement linger, then delivered the final blow. And what did he say? He said the suspect was a black male, medium build, wearing dark clothing. Malcolm's fist clenched beneath the table. Objection. That description could apply to thousands of men in this city. It is broad, unreliable, and lacks any definitive identification. Lancaster's gavel hit the bench with a sharp crack. Mr. Carter, I have already warned you about unnecessary objections. With all due respect, Your Honor, Malcolm pressed, his voice firm, the prosecution is presenting vague, uncorroborated testimony as irrefutable proof. Lancaster fixed him with a hard stare. And you will have your turn to cross-examine. Until then, sit down. Malcolm sat, but his frustration simmered just beneath the surface. He glanced at Jerome, whose face remained unreadable, though his knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the table. He had been through this before. He had seen this exact strategy play out time and time again. A faceless suspect, a weak identification, and a system willing to fill in the gaps with its own assumptions. Calloway continued, unfazed. We also have the defendant's location at the time of the crime. While Mr. Willis claims he was at home, there is no solid alibi to confirm this. His word against the evidence. He turned to the jury, his expression grave. And let's be honest, what kind of man runs when questioned by the police? Malcolm shot up. Objection. The prosecution is deliberately implying guilt based on my client's reaction to an unjustified arrest. Sustained, Lancaster said at last, though her tone carried little weight. Move on, Mr. Calloway. Malcolm exhaled, knowing it was only a minor victory. The seed had already been planted. He had seen it before: the subtle manipulation, the quiet reinforcement of stereotypes, the gentle push that led jurors down a preordained path. Calloway turned, his expression that of a man who had just been mildly inconvenienced. Let's focus on the facts then, he said smoothly. A crime was committed. A suspect matching the general description was identified. The defendant has no solid alibi. The surveillance footage places him at the scene. Malcolm shook his head. That is a gross misrepresentation. The footage places a figure at the scene, a figure that could be anyone. Lancaster let out a slow, deliberate sigh. Mr. Carter, this is your final warning. Malcolm sat back, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He turned slightly toward Jerome and whispered, They've already made up their minds. Jerome didn't look at him. He simply nodded, just barely, as if he had already known. Calloway stepped closer to the jury, lowering his voice to create an air of solemn importance. At the end of the day, you must ask yourselves what makes more sense: that this is all some grand misunderstanding, or that the simplest answer is the truth. He let his words hang in the air before turning to Lancaster. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Lancaster nodded, satisfied. Very well. The defense may proceed. Malcolm took a deep breath and rose to his feet. The weight of the entire courtroom pressed against him, but he had no intention of backing down. He walked to the center of the room, scanning the jury, measuring their reactions. He had one chance to cut through the narrative Calloway had so carefully spun. Let's talk about what just happened here, Malcolm began, his voice steady. You were just told a story designed to make you believe that an innocent man is guilty, without a single shred of real evidence. Calloway scoffed. Objection. Overruled, Lancaster said, though her expression darkened. Malcolm continued. You saw the surveillance footage. Did you see Jerome Willis in that video? You saw a shadow, a figure, a blurry shape that could be anyone. He took a slow step closer to the jury. You heard the witness testimony. Did he say it was Jerome Willis? He said it was a black man of medium build. How many men fit that description in this city? A few jurors shifted, their uncertainty growing. And finally, Malcolm said, his voice lowering slightly, You were told that Jerome running meant he was guilty. But let me ask you, if you were a black man in this country, stopped by police for a crime you didn't commit, knowing how these cases usually end, would you run? He let the question linger. Silence gripped the room. Malcolm turned to Lancaster. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case on the grounds of insufficient evidence. Lancaster's fingers tightened around her gavel. Denied. Jerome Willis sat motionless, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white, his fingers pressing deep into his palms, as if trying to anchor himself to something, anything. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Hope had abandoned him long ago, eroded by years of watching men like him walk into courtrooms, just like this one, only to leave in shackles. The weight of inevitability pressed against his chest, suffocating, unrelenting. He had known how this would go the moment the police had thrown him to the ground, the moment they had sneered at his protests, the moment they had stuffed him into the back of a squad car with the kind of ease that came from routine. He had known it when they denied him a phone call for hours, when they misplaced evidence that might have helped him, when they found a witness who conveniently remembered just enough to implicate him, but not enough to be questioned. And now he knew it as he sat here, watching Malcolm Carter fight for him like a man trying to hold back a flood with nothing but his bare hands. It was useless. This courtroom belonged to Eleanor Lancaster, and she had already decided his fate. He saw it in the way she barely looked at him, in the way she dismissed every objection Malcolm made with a flick of her wrist. It was all predetermined. He was just another case number, another statistic, another sacrifice to a system that never saw him as anything more than guilty. But then something unexpected. Jerome was not the only one noticing the imbalance, the predetermined choreography of injustice unfolding before them. A shift was happening, subtle, but there. The bickering had faded, the legal jargon had dulled into background noise, and now, in the heavy silence that followed one of Lancaster's many dismissals of Malcolm's objections, a murmur of uncertainty had begun to ripple through the jury box. Some of them were seeing it the way the trial was rigged, the way Lancaster silenced every argument Malcolm tried to make before it could gain traction. A middle-aged woman in the front row frowned slightly, her lips pressing together as she glanced toward her fellow jurors. An older man to her left shifted in his seat, his brows drawing together, his hands gripping the armrests a little too tightly. They knew something was wrong. Maybe they had suspected it all along, but had convinced themselves otherwise. Maybe they had ignored the signs, lulled into complacency by the supposed sanctity of the courtroom. But now, with every ruling Lancaster made, with every unfair advantage she handed the prosecution, it was becoming harder to deny. And Lancaster saw it too. Her sharp eyes flicked toward the jury box, catching the hesitant glances, the barely perceptible shifts in posture. She recognized the warning signs of doubt, the tiny fractures forming in the facade of authority she had so carefully constructed, and she would not allow it. Her grip tightened around the gavel, her expression hardening. With a sudden, violent crack, she brought the wooden mallet down against the bench, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the chamber. The murmurs ceased instantly. Every head in the room snapped toward her. "This is a courtroom," she said, her voice carrying the cold finality of a verdict before a trial even began. Not a debate. The words, though measured, carried a sharp undercurrent of warning. Thinly veiled threat wrapped in professional indifference. The jury members stiffened. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. Whatever doubts had begun to form in their minds, whatever stirrings of unease had taken root, Lancaster had just issued a command. You will not question me. You will not interfere. You will do as you are expected to do. Malcolm's jaw tightened, his hands pressing flat against the defense table. He had seen this before, this exact moment, this exact tactic. A judge who knew she was losing control, who felt the cracks forming beneath her feet and stomped down hard to keep the foundation from breaking apart. She wielded her authority like a weapon, knowing that most people in that jury box had never had the courage to stand against it. And why would they? There was too much at risk. He glanced toward Jerome, whose face remained unreadable, though Malcolm could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself still, as if bracing for impact. This was what Lancaster wanted, to beat them into submission, to make Jerome feel powerless, to remind him that she, and only she, had the final say in whether he walked out of this courtroom or left in chains. Malcolm took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain composed, to think. He couldn't afford to react in anger. That was what Lancaster wanted. She wanted him to explode, to lose control, to give her an excuse to silence him, to frame him as the problem. Instead, he pushed back from the table, adjusting his suit jacket with deliberate, measured movements, and turned to face the jury. He could see the fear in their eyes, the way some of them avoided his gaze, as if looking at him too long might make them complicit. But he also saw something else, hesitation. A crack in the wall Lancaster had built around them. A small one, but there nonetheless. He took a step forward, his voice steady, firm. "Your Honor," he said, careful not to let even a sliver of frustration slip through. "With all due respect, it seems that what is happening here today isn't a debate, but it certainly isn't a fair trial either." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Lancaster's expression darkened. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice laced with cold amusement, as if she was daring him to take one step further, to give her a reason to strike him down. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, considering his next words carefully. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, waiting, watching. He had a choice. He could back down, allow Lancaster to reassert her dominance, and let the jury sink back into passive compliance. Or he could push forward, chip away at the illusion of fairness she had spent years maintaining. His decision was made before he even had time to fully consider the alternative. "I would never dream of disrespecting this courtroom," Malcolm said, his voice deceptively smooth. "But I also won't sit by while justice is being twisted beyond recognition." He turned slightly, sweeping his gaze across the jury. "I hope you're all paying attention, because what you do in the next few hours will determine whether an innocent man loses everything. And the only thing standing between him and a lifetime behind bars is whether or not you are willing to see what's right in front of you." Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Lancaster's fingers curled around her gavel, her lips pressing into a thin line. She could feel the shift in the air. She had spent decades ensuring that no one ever challenged her authority. But for the first time in 24 years, someone had dared to push back. And worse, as some of them were starting to listen. The air in the courtroom was thick with inevitability, every breath drawn like the final moments before an execution. Judge Eleanor Lancaster sat rigid at her bench, fingers wrapped around her gavel, ready to deliver the words that would seal Jerome Willis's fate. The prosecution was already victorious, their smirks barely concealed, while Malcolm Carter stood stone-faced, knowing he had done everything he could in a fight that had been lost before it even began. The jury, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and resignation, shifted in their seats, bound by the silent pressure of a system that had already decided. Then the doors crashed open. A gasp rippled through the room, heads swiveled toward the entrance. The courtroom doors, heavy oak and intimidating, stood ajar, framing the silhouette of a woman in dark slacks and a fitted blazer. She stepped forward, each click of her heels against the polished floor echoing like a countdown. Sophie Bennett. A name few had spoken in years, a name that Judge Eleanor Lancaster had hoped never to hear again. Whispers ignited like sparks through the gallery, murmurs of shock weaving through the crowd. Malcolm's breath hitched, his sharp instincts snapping into focus. He had spent years trying to bring Lancaster down, but he had never expected this. Sophie Bennett had vanished 3 years ago, swallowed by the unknown, erased from the legal world without a trace. Yet here she was, walking into this courtroom at this moment. At the judge's bench, Lancaster's face drained of color. For the first time, the mask of absolute control cracked. Her fingers trembled against the wood, the gavel slipping slightly in her grasp. Her lips parted, but no words came. She was frozen. Malcolm saw it, the rare, undeniable flicker of fear. Sophie stopped at the center of the room, her presence a force that had shifted the entire balance of power. Her gaze locked onto Lancaster, unwavering, unshaken. "Your Honor," Malcolm broke the silence, his voice slicing through the tension. "It seems we have an unexpected guest." Lancaster's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. This is highly irregular," she managed, though her voice wavered, betraying her. "This witness has no standing here." Sophie raised a single brow. "No standing?" she echoed, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I was your clerk for 10 years. You and I both know I have standing." The jury watched, their growing unease now fully cemented as suspicion. Malcolm took a step forward. "Why don't we hear what she has to say?" Lancaster's fingers clenched into fists. For the first time in 24 years, she was no longer in control. Malcolm Carter moved swiftly across the courtroom, his footsteps deliberate, each one echoing against the cold marble floor. The weight of the moment pressed down on the air, thick and suffocating. Every eye in the room was locked on Sophie Bennett, the woman who had disappeared 3 years ago and now stood in the heart of Lancaster's domain, ready to bring it all crumbling down. His voice cut through the tense silence, sharp and demanding. "Do you have evidence?" Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet certainty, the kind that came from knowing she was about to detonate a truth that could not be ignored. Slowly, methodically, she reached into her pocket. The movement was small, almost insignificant, yet the entire courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Then from the depths of her blazer, she pulled out a small black USB drive. It was unremarkable in appearance, a simple device no bigger than a thumb, yet in that moment, it carried more weight than anything else in the room. She held it up between her fingers, letting the dim light catch its smooth surface, and for the first time, a crack of uncertainty flashed across Judge Eleanor Lancaster's face. The murmur that had been bubbling through the gallery erupted into a low roar, a ripple of realization spreading through the spectators, the jury, even the prosecution. Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink, didn't dare take his eyes off the tiny object that had just shifted the balance of power. Lancaster's reaction was immediate. Her fingers, which had been resting on her bench with calculated composure, curled into fists. A muscle in her jaw twitched. She had faced countless lawyers, defendants, and activists who had tried to challenge her authority, and she had crushed them all without breaking a sweat. But this was different. Her voice, when it finally came, was strained but controlled. "This is irrelevant." Malcolm let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Irrelevant?" He turned to face the jury, gesturing toward Sophie. "A witness just walked into this courtroom carrying potential proof of judicial misconduct, and your response is to dismiss it?" Sophie took a step forward, gripping the USB tighter. "This drive contains years' worth of case files, audio recordings, and transcripts documents proving that Judge Lancaster systematically manipulated verdicts, suppressed evidence, and condemned innocent people." Lancaster slammed her gavel down, her mask of control slipping further. "Enough!" But the authority in her voice no longer carried the weight it once did. Malcolm's voice was quiet, but unshakable. "No, Judge. I think this is just getting started." Malcolm Carter moved with the certainty of a man who knew the walls of power were finally crumbling. The USB felt cold in his palm, deceptively light for something that carried the weight of so many stolen lives. Every eye in the courtroom followed him as he crossed the room, his footsteps steady, deliberate, the anticipation thick enough to choke on. The prosecution watched him with barely concealed panic, the jury's expressions shifting from wary curiosity to something sharper, something dangerous doubt. He reached the court's audio system, inserted the drive, and tapped a button. The silence stretched, taut and uneasy, as the system processed the data. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then a voice filled the room, cold, unfeeling, absolute. "I don't care if they're guilty or not, as long as I get paid." The words slammed into the courtroom like a sledgehammer. A collective gasp rippled through the space, an almost physical reaction to the sheer audacity of what had just been said. There was no mistaking that voice. It was Lancaster. A tremor ran through the jury box. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hand. One of the men in the back, who had been sitting stiffly throughout the trial, suddenly leaned forward, as if needing to hear it again, as if his brain refused to process what his ears had just taken in. And then, another line. "The jury listens to me, The defense? Irrelevant. The verdict? Already decided. The murmur of shock turned into chaos. People in the gallery whispered furiously, heads whipping toward one another in disbelief. A man in the second row let out a bitter, humorless laugh, disbelief turning into anger. Someone else muttered, "My God." At the prosecution's table, Daniel Calloway had gone sheet white. His normally confident hands, so steady when delivering cutting arguments, trembled as they hovered uselessly over his legal pad. His pen slipped from his fingers, rolling across the desk. Forgotten. Malcolm watched it all unfold, but his gaze remained locked onto Lancaster. She had frozen. For the first time in 24 years, Eleanor Lancaster had no control over her courtroom. The authority she wielded like a weapon had been ripped from her grasp, shattered beyond repair. And then she snapped. Lancaster shot up from her chair, her hands slamming onto the bench. "This is outrageous," she barked, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. This is falsified evidence. A fabrication." Malcolm took a slow step forward, his voice as sharp as a blade. "Is it?" He gestured toward the jury. "Are you saying that isn't your voice?" Lancaster opened her mouth, paused. For a fraction of a second, just a flicker of time, she hesitated. And that was all it took. Because everyone had heard it. A crack had formed in the once impenetrable armor of Judge Eleanor Lancaster. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. The world saw it. Another recording played. "The B jury is just a formality. They'll do what I want. They always do." A sound erupted from the crowd, a choked sob. A woman in the gallery had started crying, silent tears rolling down her cheeks as she shook her head. She wasn't the only one. One man's hands were clenched into fists against his knees, his face twisted in barely restrained fury. A juror, a man who had looked uncertain before, now sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes locked onto Lancaster with something close to disgust. Calloway tried to recover. "Objection!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "This evidence is sustained," Lancaster snapped. Her gavel slammed down so hard it nearly splintered the wood. Desperation. "Mr. Carter, you will cease this immediately." Malcolm didn't even flinch. He turned to Sophie, who stood just a few feet away, unwavering. "Are there more?" She nodded. "Plenty." Lancaster lost it. "I will have you held in contempt," she screamed. "I will—" Her voice cut off as Malcolm stepped closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You will what?" The challenge hung in the air. The courtroom was no longer hers. For the first time, Lancaster seemed to realize it. Her hands curled into fists, her breathing uneven. The jury had turned against her. The gallery had turned against her. Even Calloway, her loyal, ambitious puppet, looked like a man struggling to justify what he had just heard. And Malcolm wasn't finished. He reached for the laptop connected to the audio system and tapped a key. A final recording played. Lancaster's voice, colder than ever. "Justice isn't real. It's just a word we use to keep the public quiet. People like me, we're the ones who decide how the world works." And then silence. Not just quiet, not just a lull in the noise. Dead, heavy, silence. The kind that buried careers, the kind that ended legacies, the kind that meant this was over. And Lancaster knew it. She stood there trembling, her entire world unraveling before her eyes. Someone whispered from the jury box, barely audible. "Monster." Malcolm exhaled, the weight of the moment settling in. Then turning back to Lancaster, he delivered the final blow. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, controlled, "I move for an immediate mistrial based on irrefutable proof of judicial misconduct." Lancaster clenched her jaw so tight it looked like she might break her own teeth. Her knuckles were white. And then for the first time in 24 years, Judge Eleanor Lancaster had no choice but to listen. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The gavel had barely settled from Lancaster's last desperate strike when the heavy doors of the courtroom burst open once more. The sharp crack of wood against wood was drowned out by the commanding stomp of polished boots against marble floors. A ripple of tension surged through the already electrified room. A collective inhale of shock and anticipation. Two men in dark suits strode inside, their movements crisp, deliberate. They wore the unmistakable air of authority, of men who had walked into countless rooms just like this and dismantled the untouchable. The lead agent, a tall man with a steel-eyed gaze, wasted no time. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Judge Eleanor Lancaster," he announced, his tone devoid of emotion, "you are under arrest for abuse of power and judicial misconduct." Courtroom erupted. Gasps tore through the gallery, whispers swelling into a frenzied hum. Jurors exchanged stunned looks, their eyes darting between the agents and Lancaster, as if struggling to reconcile what was happening. The prosecution sat in frozen disbelief, Calloway paling as reality crashed down around him. The reporters in the back fumbled for their notepads, pens scratching furiously against paper, their hands shaking with the sheer magnitude of the moment. Malcolm Carter didn't move. He had waited for this. He had fought for this. And now, as Lancaster sat at the center of her own undoing, he would not look away. For a fraction of a second, she didn't move either. The color drained from her face, her perfectly composed mask cracking like shattered glass. Then, as the words sank in, her shock morphed into something far more primal. Panic. "No!" The word was barely more than a whisper at first, a breathless denial, a refusal to accept what she had just heard. Her fingers clutched the edge of her bench as if she could somehow anchor herself, as if the weight of her own courtroom could save her. Then she exploded. "This is absurd," she shrieked, surging to her feet so suddenly that her chair toppled over with a sharp crack. Her face twisted, the once composed judge now a woman unhinged. "I am a sitting judge. You cannot do this." The lead agent remained impassive, unmoved by her outburst. He took a slow, deliberate step closer, holding the warrant firmly in front of him. "Your position does not place you above the law, Judge Lancaster. You have the right to remain silent." She did not remain silent. She lunged. Her hands slammed against the bench as she leaned forward, her voice wild with desperation. "This is a mistake. This is corruption." Her gaze darted around the room, searching, begging for support. She locked eyes with Calloway, but he merely sat there, stiff and useless, his face carved from stone. The jury didn't move. The gallery did not move. There was no one left to save her. "You think you can do this to me?" she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of hysteria. "I made this courtroom. I made all of you." The second agent stepped forward, a pair of gleaming handcuffs in his grip. "Eleanor Lancaster, place your hands behind your back." The moment those words left his lips, something in her snapped. She twisted, her breath coming in frantic gasps, her body jerking backward, as if the very thought of being restrained repulsed her. Her hands flew up in protest. "No, no, I will not!" The agents moved in. Lancaster fought like a cornered animal, her arms flailing wildly as she twisted against them. "I am the law. Do you hear me? I am the law." The courtroom was no longer hers. The gavel that had once silenced others now lay useless on the bench, a hollow reminder of power lost. The walls that had once caged countless innocent men now seemed to close in on her instead. Eleanor Lancaster had ruled her courtroom like a monarch, her authority absolute, her word law. But now, as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around her wrists, she was no longer the one delivering the verdict, she was the one receiving it. She twisted, her breath ragged, her once imposing figure now trembling under the weight of a reality she had never imagined for herself. Her sharp blue eyes darted wildly across the room, searching, begging for someone, anyone, to stand by her. But no one did. Not the jury, who had sat through this trial with growing unease, now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to quiet satisfaction. Not the spectators, some of whom had been victims of her ruthless rulings, who now whispered to each other in disbelief, their murmurs carrying the quiet hum of justice finally being served. Not even the police officers who had, for decades, followed her orders without question. They stood still, their hands resting at their sides, their gazes cast downward. None of them moved, none of them spoke. They would not protect her. And then there was Daniel Calloway, her most trusted ally, the man who had built his career under her wing, who had wielded the power she had granted him with arrogance and confidence. But now as she turned to him, demanding his support, she was met with nothing but silence. Calloway sat motionless, his usually composed face now pale, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He didn't meet her gaze. He didn't object. He didn't say a single word. Lancaster's breath hitched. A flicker of desperation crossed her face. Calloway, her voice once firm and commanding, was now cracked, almost pleading. You know this is a mistake. Say something. Do something. But Calloway didn't move. Instead, his jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. His career, his reputation, his entire future had been tied to Lancaster's power, and now that power was gone. He had seen the recordings, just like everyone else. He had heard her voice condemning herself, just like everyone else. And so, for the first time, he chose silence. Lancaster's chest rose and fell in quick, erratic breaths. Her world was disintegrating, crumbling around her, and no one, not the jury, not the police, not her prosecution, not even the walls of this courtroom she had once ruled so mercilessly would save her. She jerked against the cuffs, trying to shake them off as though sheer defiance could undo them. No, you cannot do this to me. I am Judge Eleanor Lancaster. The lead FBI agent remained expressionless as he finished securing the cuffs. Not anymore. The words hit harder than any verdict she had ever delivered. She struggled again, but the cuffs did not yield. They tightened. The cold steel bit into her skin, just as it had for the countless innocent men she had sentenced over the years. And then Malcolm Carter stepped forward. The room fell into an eerie stillness as he moved toward her, his presence no longer that of a lawyer standing before a judge, but of a man standing before a fallen tyrant. She looked at him then, and for the first time since the trial had begun, she looked afraid. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't revel in her downfall. Instead, he simply held her gaze, and then with quiet, unshakable certainty, he spoke the words that sealed her fate. It looks like justice has finally caught up with you. The courtroom, the same one that had once been Lancaster's domain, now belonged to the people, and justice, real justice, had finally arrived. The air in the courtroom was thick with an unbearable tension, a silence so heavy it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Every pair of eyes was locked on the jury box, waiting, expecting, dreading. The chaos of the past few minutes, the stunning downfall of Judge Eleanor Lancaster, the explosive evidence, the shock waves of revelation had left the room trembling on the edge of something monumental. And now, it was time. The foreman of the jury, an older man with silvering hair and deep lines etched into his face, rose to his feet. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the verdict slip, the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him. He took a breath, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. In the case of the state of Alabama versus Jerome Willis, Jerome barely breathed. His hands, still bound by cold, unrelenting steel, were clenched into fists, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had spent so long preparing for the worst, so long resigning himself to a fate he had never deserved, that the possibility of another outcome felt impossible. The foreman's eyes flickered across the room, landing on Jerome for the briefest of moments before he spoke the words that changed everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The room exploded. A gasp rippled through the gallery, a collective exhale of shock, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. Someone clapped a hand over their mouth, muffling a sob. A woman in the second row let out a broken, whispered, "Oh my God." Malcolm Carter's breath left him in a slow exhale, his fingers pressing into the table before him, as if grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened. He turned, searching for Jerome's reaction, but Jerome hadn't moved. He sat frozen, his entire body rigid, his expression unreadable. His lips barely parted, his chest unmoving, his eyes locked on the jury as if waiting for them to correct themselves, to say it had been a mistake, a cruel joke. It had to be a mistake. Not guilty. The words didn't fit. They didn't make sense. They had never been meant for men like him. He had walked into this courtroom expecting only one ending. He had seen it happen before, had watched as men who looked like him were railroaded into convictions they could never escape from. He had heard the final gavel strikes, the sentences that crushed lives, the verdicts that were never in doubt. But now they were saying something different. Jerome blinked, once, twice. Still, the words hung there. Not guilty. The sound of movement pulled him from his daze. A uniformed officer, one who had once dragged him into this room in chains, was stepping forward, a key in his hand. The officer hesitated for only a moment before reaching down, gripping the cuffs encircling Jerome's wrists. Jerome flinched. The officer paused. His grip softened just slightly, and then, with a sharp click, the cuffs fell away. For the first time in years, Jerome's wrists were free. Jerome Willis stared at his hands, his fingers trembling as he turned them over, palms facing up, then down, as if trying to understand what had just happened. For years, they had been bound by chains, by injustice, by a system that had never meant to let him go. But now, for the first time in years, his wrists were free. The cold steel that had defined his existence was gone, lying discarded on the table like the remnants of a nightmare. He flexed his fingers slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly, reality would snap back into place, and he would wake up in a cell, shackled once more. The courtroom around him was alive with emotion. In the gallery, a woman sobbed openly, her hands clasped over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. She wasn't the only one. Others wiped at their eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of what they had just witnessed, the unraveling of a system that had condemned so many like him. The rare and almost impossible moment when justice had actually won. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man with gray at his temples, exhaled sharply and almost unconsciously began to clap. It was a hesitant sound at first, almost as if he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to break the heavy silence. Then, another juror joined him, then another. The sound swelled, rising from the jury box, spreading through the crowd, building into something undeniable, a release of tension, of disbelief, of collective relief that, for once, the right thing had been done. Jerome barely registered it. He could still hear the echo of the words that had shattered the reality he had come to accept. Not guilty. The phrase rang in his head, over and over, like a bell tolling in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Malcolm Carter stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "Jerome," he said, pulling him back from the storm of his thoughts. "It's over." Jerome's breath caught in his throat. Was it? Could it really be? His entire life he had been told otherwise. From the moment he was old enough to understand how the world worked, he had been conditioned to believe that freedom was not for men like him, that the system didn't make mistakes, it simply did what it was designed to do. And yet, here he was, standing in a courtroom, unchained, free. His eyes flickered toward the back of the room, where the press had gathered, their cameras capturing every second of this moment. He knew what this meant, not just for him, but for every man who had ever sat where he had sat, hands cuffed, waiting for a fate they couldn't escape. The reality hit him like a blow to the chest. His legs suddenly felt weak, as if they might give out beneath him. He stumbled slightly, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Malcolm's hand was there, firm on his shoulder, grounding him. Jerome squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to force himself to believe this was real. When he opened them again, he let out a slow, shaky breath. I don't know what to do." His voice was raw, hoarse from hours of silence, from years of swallowing down his pain. I never thought this day would come." Malcolm's grip tightened slightly. "Then take your time," he said. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just know this, you're free." The words hit Jerome like a tidal wave, drowning him in a reality he had never dared to hope for. He looked down at his hands again. They were his now, no longer claimed by the state, no longer bound. For the first time in years, he lifted them, not in surrender, not in defense, not in restraint, but in freedom. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Malcolm Carter stood in the center of the courtroom, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze sweeping across the room. The air was thick with something beyond tension, a reckoning. The weight of the moment pressed against everyone present, but Malcolm was not here for celebration. Not yet. The murmurs of disbelief and relief that had rippled through the room moments earlier began to settle, replaced by something else: expectation. Every eye turned toward him, waiting, watching. Even the press, their cameras still flashing, their pens scratching furiously across their notepads, felt at the pull of the moment, the need for something more. Malcolm took a breath, slow and measured, his voice low but resonant. "Don't pretend this is the first time this has happened." The words struck like a hammer against glass, shattering any illusions that might have lingered in the minds of those who wanted to believe this trial had been an anomaly, a mistake corrected, an isolated incident. He took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "And don't pretend it won't happen again." The truth in those words hung in the air, undeniable. The jury, the spectators, even the officers standing at the edges of the room, they knew. They had seen it before. The rushed convictions, the missing evidence. The jurors steered toward a verdict before a case had even begun. The lawyers, like Malcolm, who fought against a system designed to beat them down. The men like Jerome, who were guilty the moment they walked into a courtroom, guilty before they even had a chance to speak. Malcolm let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle in every chest, in every conscience. Then with quiet intensity, he spoke again. Jerome Willis walked into this courtroom an innocent man. He let his words sink in, his gaze flickering to the jury, the prosecution, the press. But if this had been any other day, any other judge, any other courtroom, would we be standing here right now? No one answered. They didn't have to, because the truth was written in their faces. Malcolm inhaled sharply, steadying himself, his fist clenched at his sides. "Justice is not an accident." His voice rose slightly, firm and unshakable. "It does not happen because we hope for it. It does not happen because we expect those in power to suddenly find their conscience." A pause. The silence now was thick, alive. Justice is not given. It is taken back. Someone in the gallery murmured in agreement. A single clap rang out, then another. But Malcolm wasn't finished. His eyes burned with something deep, something old, something forged through years of fighting battles he wasn't always sure he could win. "And if we leave here today believing that this verdict means the fight is over, then we are fools." More murmurs, a shift in the energy of the room. He was pulling them in, making them see, making them feel. His voice softened, but the force behind it only grew. "Because out there," he gestured toward the doors, toward the world beyond this courtroom, "there are 1,000 more cases just like this one. There are 1,000 more men just like Jerome, sitting, waiting, wondering if anyone will speak for them." A tightness gripped his chest, because he knew their faces. He had sat across from them in holding cells, seen the exhaustion in their eyes, the resignation in their slumped shoulders. He had seen them bury hope before their cases had even begun. And today they were watching, through news cameras, through headlines, through whispers in holding cells where men like Jerome sat, praying for a miracle. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "So what are we going to do?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't meant to linger and fade. It was a demand, a challenge, a call to fight. And this time, when the gallery responded, it wasn't just a murmur. It was a roar. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jerome Willis stepped into the light. The sun struck his face, warm and blinding, so different from the cold fluorescent bulbs that had illuminated every moment of his captivity. He flinched slightly, as if his body had forgotten what sunlight felt like, as if freedom itself was something foreign, something he wasn't sure he was allowed to claim. Malcolm Carter walked beside him, his movements slow, deliberate. The tension of the trial, of the fight, of the war they had waged inside that courtroom still clung to him. But out here, with the city stretching before them, it felt lighter. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. Jerome exhaled, his breath shaky. His feet touched the pavement like they didn't belong there, like the ground might suddenly shift and pull him back into the abyss. He had walked out of courthouses before, but always in shackles, always knowing another cell waited for him. But not today. Today he was free. Behind them, the murmurs of the courtroom hadn't fully faded. The weight of what had happened in that room still lingered in the air. Reporters whispered frantically into microphones. Their voices barely contained excitement as they relayed the unbelievable: a black man had walked into Judge Eleanor Lancaster's courtroom, accused of a crime, and he had walked out innocent. But Malcolm knew better than to let the moment fool him. He turned back, looking over his shoulder at the courtroom, at the people who still stood inside. Some watching him, some still too stunned to move. The jury, the spectators, the officers who had once followed Lancaster's every command. They were changed now. They had seen something they could not unsee. They had heard something they could not unhear. And they knew. They knew. But knowing wasn't enough. So Malcolm squared his shoulders, let his gaze sweep across them one last time, and spoke, his voice strong, unwavering. This fight isn't over. A hush fell over those still inside, their faces lifting toward him as if drawn by something they couldn't ignore. Justice doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come often. He took a step forward, making sure they understood. Today we clawed back a small piece of it, but one man's freedom doesn't mean the system is fixed. One verdict doesn't erase what we all know is still happening. His words landed like thunder, undeniable, unforgiving. Out there, right now, there are more men like Jerome sitting in cells, waiting for trials that aren't fair, waiting for juries that have already made up their minds, waiting for judges who see them as nothing more than a case number. The weight of it settled on their faces, their shoulders. Some of them looked away, but some of them didn't. Some of them listened. Malcolm's voice softened, but it did not waver. We can't pretend this was a victory, not yet. He looked at the faces before him, searching for something in them: conviction, anger, the spark of something that might turn into action. Then he turned back toward Jerome, the man who had just walked free but still carried the scars of his sentence. The sun bathed them both, golden and unwavering. Malcolm let out a slow breath. But today we took the first step, and with that, they stepped into the world that had almost forgotten them. But this time the world was watching. The story of Jerome Willis, Malcolm Carter, and Judge Eleanor Lancaster goes far beyond a simple courtroom drama. At its core, it is a powerful reflection on justice, prejudice, corruption, and the relentless human struggle against injustice. It serves not just as entertainment, but as a profound human lesson, resonating deeply in a world where the ideals of justice are often compromised by systemic bias, unchecked power, and societal apathy. Firstly, this narrative reveals the destructive force of racial prejudice and bias. Jerome Willis, a black man unjustly accused of armed robbery, embodies countless individuals worldwide who have been unfairly targeted, judged, and condemned based solely on their race or identity. His case painfully illustrates the harsh reality many face: the assumption of guilt based not on evidence, but on deeply rooted stereotypes and prejudice. Society often unknowingly perpetuates this vicious cycle, silently endorsing injustice through passive acceptance or willful ignorance. Jerome's plight reminds us vividly that true justice cannot coexist with racial or cultural prejudice. We are compelled through his suffering to acknowledge our collective responsibility to dismantle stereotypes and challenge the prejudices deeply embedded in our institutions. Judge Eleanor Lancaster symbolizes the peril inherent in absolute power without accountability. Lancaster's decades-long reign of manipulation and corruption vividly demonstrates how unchecked authority can corrupt even the most revered positions of public trust. Her courtroom, once a sanctuary for justice, became a stage for exploitation, abuse of power, and personal gain. Lancaster believed she was untouchable, that the system existed to serve her interests. However, her ultimate downfall reminds us poignantly that power without accountability inevitably leads to moral decay. It serves as a stark warning: unchecked authority not only harms individuals, but also erodes public trust in the very institutions meant to safeguard justice and fairness. The character of Malcolm Carter stands as a powerful testament to resilience, courage, and the moral obligation to fight injustice. Malcolm represents the unwavering force of those who dare to stand against systemic oppression, even when the odds appear insurmountable. His relentless determination to defend Jerome Willis, despite knowing the deck was stacked against him, demonstrates the essential nature of perseverance in the pursuit of justice. Malcolm embodies the belief that one voice, firm and resolute, can ignite change. His courage challenges us to recognize our duty as individuals to advocate fiercely for justice, even when the world seems indifferent or hostile. Malcolm's example reinforces the idea that justice does not occur passively, it must be actively and courageously pursued. Through Jerome's profound personal struggle, the audience is confronted with the harsh reality of systemic injustice. Jerome had lived under the shadow of suspicion, knowing his freedom depended not on his actions, but on the biases of a broken system. His disbelief upon hearing the verdict of innocence speaks volumes about the crushing weight of perpetual injustice. His story is not merely a triumph, but a bitter reminder of how normalized injustice has become. Jerome's journey from hopelessness to liberation emphasizes that true justice means confronting uncomfortable truths about society's failures. It highlights the importance of empathy, understanding, and collective accountability in rectifying systemic flaws. The emotional climax of the story, where the jury declares Jerome not guilty, underscores a crucial message. Justice, though often delayed, can prevail. The spontaneous reaction from the gallery, the tears, applause, and visible relief, captures the collective yearning for fairness inherent in every community. It signifies a communal awakening, a moment when people recognize not only Jerome's innocence, but the countless injustices perpetrated before him. This moment compels audiences to consider their own roles in perpetuating or challenging injustice. It is a powerful call to action, reminding everyone that silence and complacency are complicity in injustice. Malcolm's final address to the courtroom encapsulates the story's deepest message. Justice is not something freely given. It is something we must reclaim. This assertion drives home the idea that passive acceptance will never dismantle unjust systems. True justice requires vigilance, courage, and continuous action. Malcolm's words resonate as a call to collective responsibility, urging individuals to confront injustice actively, not just within legal frameworks, but also within societal attitudes and behaviors. His statement emphasizes that justice is not static. It is dynamic, constantly fought for, continuously defended, and vigilantly preserved. In the final scenes, Jerome and Malcolm step outside into the sunlight, symbolizing hope, renewal, and the possibility of change. Yet Malcolm's parting words caution that the struggle is far from over. His assertion that the battle isn't finished reminds us that systemic change requires ongoing effort and vigilance. Each victory, while significant, is merely one step on a long road toward true equity and fairness. The story does not end with Jerome's acquittal. It challenges audiences to remain committed to the pursuit of justice beyond individual cases. Ultimately, this story teaches a profound human lesson. Our shared humanity demands an unwavering commitment to justice, accountability, and equality. It exposes uncomfortable truths about societal biases and the misuse of power, while offering a compelling vision of resilience, hope, and change. It urges us to recognize injustice, empathize with those who suffer under it, and take meaningful action to correct systemic wrongs. In reflecting upon Jerome's trial, audiences understand that justice is more than just a verdict. It is the very foundation upon which trust, dignity, and societal harmony rest. This narrative powerfully conveys that a system failing even one individual fails us all. Jerome's story underscores the vital truth that society's strength depends not on the power of its institutions, but on its willingness to protect its most vulnerable members. In conclusion, Jerome Willis's trial, Malcolm Carter's courageous fight, and Eleanor Lancaster's downfall collectively remind us of humanity's shared obligation to actively pursue justice, confront biases, and hold power accountable. They emphasize the critical importance of empathy, courage, and vigilance in preserving the integrity of justice. Through their intertwined stories, we are reminded that the fight for justice is continuous and demanding, yet profoundly necessary. Justice is not merely a lofty ideal, it is a vital human right that must be protected, pursued, and reclaimed by us all. This story is more than just an account of one man's fight for justice, it's a call to action for all of us. Jerome Willis's battle represents countless individuals facing similar injustice worldwide. We cannot remain passive observers when the fundamental rights of our fellow human beings are at stake. It's not enough to acknowledge injustice. We must actively challenge it wherever we see it, be it in our courts, communities, or conversations. We must educate ourselves and others, confronting biases, prejudices, and stereotypes that underpin systemic inequality. Engage with your community, attend public forums, support legal reform efforts, and speak up against injustice when you encounter it. Support those who tirelessly advocate for change, lawyers, activists, and organizations dedicated to dismantling unfair practices in our justice system. Your voice, your vote, and your involvement have the power to shape a fairer world. Participate actively in democracy, holding leaders and institutions accountable. Volunteer with organizations that fight wrongful convictions, racism, and systemic bias. Remember, silence and inaction fuel injustice. Your involvement can break the chains of prejudice and oppression. Most importantly, remain vigilant. Justice requires continuous effort. It is never guaranteed. Today's victory, as powerful as it is, represents only a small step. Let this moment inspire you to act, advocate, and educate. Stand united, speak boldly, and refuse to accept a world where fairness is conditional and justice is scarce. Together, we have the strength to reclaim justice not just for Jerome Willis, but for every individual facing injustice. Commit yourself today. Take action, lend your voice, and join the fight for a truly just society. The responsibility rests with all of us. Let's rise to the challenge, ensuring that justice isn't merely hoped for, but actively created and fiercely defended. If Jerome Willis's journey moved you, if Malcolm Carter's courageous fight for justice inspired hope within your heart, then your support is essential to keeping this powerful message alive. Every story of injustice, every voice raised against corruption, and every step toward truth relies on your engagement. By simply clicking like, you're amplifying a message of justice, equality, and resilience. Your share can spread awareness, igniting conversations and inspiring others to recognize and challenge injustice in their own communities. We believe deeply that stories hold the power to change hearts and minds, but their true power depends on you. Subscribe to our channel to join a passionate community committed to raising awareness, promoting fairness, and confronting injustice wherever it may be found. Your subscription means you'll never miss the next powerful narrative, the next story that could change someone's perspective or even their life. Let your action today show the world that justice matters, that you stand with those who fight against oppression and prejudice. Hit the like button, share this video widely, and subscribe now to become an integral part of the journey toward a fairer, more just society. Together, we can make sure voices like Jerome's and Malcolm's continue to echo powerfully, inspiring real change.